guys are looking for the actual copy of press release, it's in that table right before you walked in.
We're using the malt box.
Huh?
We're using the malt box. Speaker.
Well, that microphone will be on over the speaker, but
So we're pulling it all together.
I guess I don't know. I'm not, I don't know, Mike, I don't, yeah, if.
We'll make it work.
If you know something that I don't, he has been around for a long time.
Oh, yeah, so we gotta change that about some basketball game.
Are you using the microphone on the podium? Is it turned on?
Doesn't turn on.
Because it needs a new battery.
Oh,
Well, it was on.
yeah, well, there we go.
Yeah.
The chat. I'll let you deal with that. We aren't using it. I don't know.
Testing 1, 2, testing. I'd like to share it from your site. Well, actually, Denise will do it, but it would be nice if we could share it from your site. So it originally comes from the police department, and then we'll share it.
I guess we can. I'll just stand off to the side.
And then the first one
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Mic check, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. We good? Good, 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 okay.
Is everyone okay if we get started?
Do you mind if I just throw my microphone up there? I'm so
Sure.
sorry.
She might forget.
You guys ready? Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for being here today. My name is Amy Devine. I'm the first assistant Scott County Attorney with the Scott County Attorney's Office. And with me here this morning is Special Agent Derek Reeson. He's employed with the Division of Criminal Investigations. Also with me is the Chief of Police for the City of Bettendorf, Chief Kimball. The purpose of today's press conference is to announce the results of the investigation into the officer-involved shooting that occurred back on September 3rd of this year at 1111 16.5 Street in Bettendorf. We have handed out a written version of the press release to those of you who are here today, but I will go through and discuss the relevant facts of the case, details of the investigation, and then I will announce the County Attorney's Office's decision. On September 3rd of this year, officers with the Bettendorf Police Department were dispatched to 1111 16.5 Street here in Bettendorf because a 911 call had been placed. Initially, information was relayed or dispatched to the officers that a female was bleeding. And then additional information had been relayed that a male was holding a knife and he was holding it to someone's throat. So multiple officers from the Bettendorf Police Department responded to the residence. The residence was also operating as a daycare that day. When they initially arrived at the scene, the officers staged or set up around the residence in order to assess the situation. It was a bit later that officers then learned that the person who had the knife to their throat was a 4-year-old child. The overhead garage door was open, and so the officers, or some of the officers, went inside of the garage, again in order to continue to assess the situation and determine what their next course of action should be. It was at that time that when the officers went inside of the garage, they could hear screaming coming from inside of the residence. Officer Patrick Misick was one of the officers who went inside of the garage. Another officer at the scene had been actually trying to place phone calls to the residents, but those phone calls went unanswered. After additional yelling and screaming was heard from inside of the residence, Officer Misick decided to try the doors that were inside of the garage that go into the residence. There were actually 2 of them, a screen door and a main door. As Officer Misick began to open the main door, the door was immediately pushed back on him, and a man on the other side of the door screamed at him not to come inside. At that time, officers announced themselves as being police, City of Bettendorf Police, and they ordered that the door be opened. Those commands were not followed. It was at that time that they decided that they needed to get inside of that house. And so after multiple attempts of kicking in the door that was being pushed back on them, finally officers were able to successfully kick in the door. And immediately upon entry to the house, or inside of the door, Officer Misek saw an adult white male kneeling on one knee, and he had a young child, a female, positioned in front of him. That male had a black-handled object at that girl's neck and a machete held against her torso. Officer Misek could see the terrified look on that young girl's face. And from his vantage point, he could actually see an adult female and a male child at the base of the basement steps. Officers yelled at the man to show them his hands multiple times. And those commands were not followed. And so it was at that time that Officer Misek fired one round with his rifle, striking the male. Another officer immediately removed the young girl away from the man and took her from the residence. The man was later identified as Timothy Clevenger, and Mr. Clevenger died as a result of the gunshot wound. Officers at the scene discovered that that black-handled item was the sheath to a knife, a fillet knife. And that fillet knife was actually located next to Mr. Clevenger, along with the machete. Officers also discovered that there were 4 other children in the residence at the time and 3 adults, and they had been ordered to the basement at knife point by Mr. Clevenger. An investigation was conducted by the Iowa Department of Public Safety, Division of Criminal Investigations. The lead agent was Special Agent Derek Reeson. He, along with other investigators with the DCI, collected hostage statements. They received and reviewed responding officers' reports. They interviewed Officer Misek, and they collected and reviewed body camera footage so that they could learn what happened at the scene that day. Hostage witnesses reported that Mr. Clevenger had come to the home that morning. And when he did, he appeared to be on a mission. Right away, he had brandished a knife, grabbed the 4-year-old girl by the throat, and ordered the others to go to the basement. He also ordered a female resident of the house to call someone else in order for them to have guns and ammo brought to the residence. It was that person, luckily, who called 911 to get help to the occupants of the house. Investigators also collected information and evidence regarding Mr. Clevenger's events leading up to the hostage incident. They discovered that Mr. Clevenger had purchased the fillet knife and the machete at a store that same morning at 11:43 a.m., just 15 minutes before the 911 call was dispatched to officers. They also obtained a video file from a thumb drive that Mr. Clevenger had recorded prior to the hostage incident, about 1 week prior. That video file name was Tim's Last or Final Thoughts. It essentially was approximately a 20-minute video in which Mr. Clevenger expresses his frustration and his anger at the political climate, as well as things that he had experienced in his life. In the video, Mr. Clevenger says at one point that justice will be served and he will be the one to serve it. And later in the video, he also states that innocent people may die. Once the investigation was completed, the DCI turns over that information to the Scott County Attorney's Office. so that we can review it and render a decision on whether or not the force used by Officer Misick on September 3rd was justified and reasonable under the law. Iowa Code Section 704.1 actually defines for us what reasonable force is, and it is what we look at to determine whether or not the officer was used or justified in his use of force. Reasonable force is that force, and no more which a reasonable person in like circumstances would judge to be necessary to prevent any injury or loss, and can include deadly force if it is reasonable to believe that such force is necessary to avoid injury or risk to one's life or the life of someone else. Reasonable force, including deadly force, may be used even if an alternative course of action is available, if the alternative entails a risk to life or safety, or the life or safety of a third party. The evidence in this case shows the use of force. The use of deadly force by Officer Misick was justified and reasonable under the circumstances. The actions by Timothy Clevenger put the lives and physical safety of the occupants of that residence in immediate danger. It was reasonable for Officer Misick to fire his weapon to prevent injury or death of that little girl or the occupants of the residence. Thank you. We will answer any questions that you have that we're able to at this time, and so we'll open it up to questions that you might have. Thank you.
I guess mine is for the chief. Chief, how is Officer Misick doing? I mean, I gotta think that even a justified shooting has to be pretty traumatic for one of your officers.
So I'll say this,
Chief, sir, if you're doing the mic.
Officer Misick, under the circumstances, is doing as well as could be expected. No officer wants to ever be put in this type of a situation in the first place. It was obviously a very difficult decision, but he's doing well, and he will be coming back to duty next week. Yeah, I appreciate you asking.
Will any of the body cam footage be available?
Because this case involves many children that were inside of the residence as well as adults, and involved the death of an individual, out of respect for their privacy and the privacy of the decedent's family, we are not releasing the body cam footage at this time. It's also important to note that while this part of the investigation is concluded, the review of the use of force by an officer and the decision that the Scott County Attorney's Office has to make about that, while that is concluded, the city of Bettendorf has their own investigation that they conduct anytime use of force might be used by any officer, deadly or otherwise. And so now that this portion is concluded, they're able to do that. And so an investigation's pending into that, and so body cam footage certainly wouldn't be able to release while that investigation's pending.
Can't the faces of the children be digitally altered to not reveal who they are and still release the footage?
Potentially, various software programs may be available to do that. I'm not sure if we have something like that. However, even if we did, we still wouldn't be releasing it at this time because the city of Bettendorf's own internal investigation that they must conduct.
So the chief, when was the last time you had an officer involved shooting?
A few years ago, we had an officer-involved shooting, but it has been 35 years since a Bettendorf police officer has taken the life of another citizen, 35 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you both.
What was Clevenger's relationship to the address or the residence there?
Mr. Clevenger actually was the owner of the resident. He acted as the landlord to the resident who ran a daycare out of that. She was his tenant.
Can you speak a little more about you said about his note. Can you add a little more detail in terms of what he was upset about? You mentioned some things, but kind of general.
The video file really just expressed his frustration and anger with the political climate That's all I'll really go into specifically, and then things that were going on in his personal life. And again, we have met with Mr. Clevenger's family. We actually met with them this morning to go through things with them. We shared some of those things with them so that they would understand, but out of respect for their privacy as well, we're not going to get into the specifics of that. This is hard enough for them as it is. They're considered victims of these crimes. They're grieving as well, so we're not going to get into the specifics of the video file. Thank you.
Do we know if there was conflict between Clevenger and the tenants?
No, there was no information that was the case. In fact, as I stated, the female resident reported to the investigators that when she saw him that day, because she had seen him plenty of times in the past, she knew something was different. He appeared to be on a mission. There was no disagreement with them, no fight or anything. He brandished that knife almost instantly and took that little girl by the throat right away when he got there.
So all evidence right now is pointing towards more of a personal issue or things that he was dealing with internally as opposed to, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know exactly who this question would be for, but obviously there were a handful of children involved in this situation. Are you able to talk about any counseling services that may have been or be provided for them at this time?
Yeah, I think I'll turn that question over to the chief.
Thanks. So, yeah, immediately, we have a police social worker here at the police department, and so we immediately made contact with other resources and have got those children and the parents and loved ones of those children for counseling services, and that's ongoing. And we are constantly keeping in contact with those families and children also as we work through this together.